I'm very pleased to welcome here today Robert Newcomb, an associate professor of Spanish and Portuguese at University of California, Davis. Newcomb is the co-director of the undergraduate Portuguese program in the Spanish and Portuguese department. He also serves as the co-editor of the Iberian and Latin American Transatlantic Studies Reader, and he's the principal investigator for the UC Comparative Iberian Studies Working Group. He's the author of a monograph entitled Nossa and Nuestra América, Inter-American Dialogues, published in 2011 by Purdue University Press. And he's currently working on a book entitled Iberianism and Crisis in Late 19th and Early 20th Century Spain and Portugal. He received a BA in Luso-Brazilian Studies and International Relations, and an MA and PhD in Luso-Brazilian Studies, all from Brown University. Very pleased to have Robert with us today. He's a fine scholar and a good friend. Please join with me in welcoming him today.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here at BYU. Before I begin my talk, I'd like to thank both the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and the David M. Kennedy Center for the hospitality that I've received here during this week, which I'm continuing to enjoy. And I'd also like to offer special thanks to my good friend, Professor Rex Nielsen. This has been a wonderful experience, and I'm looking forward to the next 2 or 3 days of discussion. Just to give you an idea of what I'm going to talk about, this is a talk that looks at the relationship between Portuguese and Brazilian literary intellectuals around the turn of the 20th century. And as I'll be discussing, I use this term somewhat loosely. I'm going to be covering a period that runs roughly from 1870 through the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The paper gets fairly technical. It delves into issues of literary criticism, but I try to draw out some of the contextual factors that had a bearing on the way that writers from these 2 Portuguese-speaking countries interacted with one another, how they dialogued, how they disagreed on certain issues. And again, as I'll discuss, these interactions are taking place during a period in which Brazil became a republic in 1889. And a series of other factors conspired to pull Portugal and Brazil away from one another. So conventionally, literary scholarship on this period has tended to focus on divergences, differences of opinion, and the rejection on the part of Brazilian writers of the Portuguese literary tradition. I'm pushing back against this interpretation in this paper by drawing out some cases of Portuguese and Brazilian writers who worked together on certain projects, who corresponded with one another, as well as certain literary ideas or motifs that came from Portugal and took hold in Brazil precisely during this period. So the goal of the paper is to show the continued importance and strength of what I term the Luso-Brazilian Republic of Letters during a period during which conventional wisdom tells us that Portuguese and Brazilian literature and culture were moving ever further apart. So that's it, basically, and I'll get right into the paper. In her ambitious and entertaining 1999 literary study, The World Republic of Letters, the critic Pascal Casanova advocates a comparative literary interpretive method that would, in her words, quote, try to detect similarities and dissimilarities between texts and look for recurring patterns. The identification of these patterns across what Casanova refers to as world literary space promises to, again in her words, bring literary frontiers into view that are independent of political boundaries. In her study, Casanova questions the nation-state as the default unit of literary analysis and challenges the coherence of what we normally understand as national literary traditions. Language, however, remains important for Casanova in determining writers' membership in broader linguistic and cultural areas that would perhaps coincide with transoceanic spaces conventionally described by terms such as francophonie, hispanidad, or in Portuguese, lusofonia. The Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa's oft-quoted declaration that, quote, "Minha pátria é a língua portuguesa," or "my country is the Portuguese language," typifies the sentiment that would give rise to what, paraphrasing Casanova, I would like to term the Luso-Brazilian Republic of Letters. And in my understanding, this republic refers both to the space of a supranational Portuguese-speaking imagined community, as well as to those Luso-Brazilian literary intellectuals who attempted to conjure it into being. Beginning with Brazil's independence in 1822, generations of Portuguese-speaking writers on both sides of the Atlantic have affirmed the existence of this republic, which attempts through language, literature, and culture to reassert or compensate for the political unity lost with the end of the Luso-Brazilian Empire, which occurs formally in 1822 with the independence of Brazil. Analysis of transatlantic Lusophone ties during the post-1822 period tends to focus on the 1950s and the 1960s, during which Portugal's authoritarian Estado Novo, or new state, appropriated the Brazilian sociologist Gilberto Freire's notion of Lusotropicalismo in order to defend its African colonies. Also, secondarily, the post-1974 period, that is, the period after Portugal returned to democratic government after the Estado Novo, is also comes in for discussion on these issues of transoceanic Lusophone ties, because this is precisely the period when Portuguese-speaking African countries, now independent, had to renegotiate their ties with the former colonial metropolis. So the turn of the 20th century, which is the period that I focus on, doesn't immediately spring to mind as a period sympathetic to the sort of supranational Luso-Brazilian literary and cultural bonds I've described. And indeed, the period is understudied by literary critics, and particularly so in terms of transoceanic literary relations. This is incidentally not at all the case, for those of you with a background in Spanish or Latin American literature, for the Spanish-speaking world during the same period, during which the Spanish-American War and the sensation caused by literary modernismo provided plenty of fodder for transoceanic dialogue. And this occurred, for instance, between the Nicaraguan poet Rubén Darío and the Spanish playwright and novelist Ramón del Valle Inclán, who then returned the favor of receiving modernista literary influence to Latin America by writing a great modernista political novel, Tirano Banderas, largely based on Valle's own experience in Mexico. But in the Luso-Brazilian case, the turn of the 20th century witnessed a sequence of events that worked to distance Portugal and Brazil politically and to destabilize both countries. Brazil's Republican coup in 1889 put the final nail in the coffin of the Luso-Brazilian Empire and also led to a transatlantic financial crisis. Brazil's diplomatic ultimatum in 1890 to Portugal regarding competing African colonial claims undermined the faltering Portuguese monarchy. And Portugal's limited intervention in a Brazilian naval revolt in 1893 and 1894 led to a temporary suspension of diplomatic relations. Further, the aggressive nationalism that characterized the early years of Brazil's old republic, and by this period I'm referring to 1889 through approximately 1894, was marked by a pronounced Lusophobia, or anti-Portuguese sentiment. At the same time, negative stereotypes about Brazil and brasileiros, here I'm referring not to actual Brazilian people, but rather to the nouveau riche Portuguese returnees from Brazil who were satirized in 19th century Portuguese novels, remained popular comic material during this period. For their part, Portuguese intellectuals during the period who were concerned with their country's perceived decline were divided between Europeanists and colonialists who looked to Africa as a site on which to build segundo Brasil, or a second Brazil, as a means to compensate for Portugal's loss of the first Brazil. Neither course appeared to reserve an important role for Portugal's former American colony. I contend, however, that it was precisely this agitated state of affairs which the Portuguese historian Oliveira Martins understood as evidence of an overarching crisis that was afflicting the entire Portuguese-speaking world. It was precisely the state of affairs that prompted writers living in essas duas colmeias de lusitanos, or these two Lusitanian hives, as the novelist Essa de Queiroz put it, and who in many cases were joined by a web of personal friendships and intellectual collaborations to affirm enduring Luso-Brazilian literary and cultural ties. And keep in mind that this is again taking place at a time when these ties were politically unpopular, especially in Brazil. This paper will be divided into two sections, and I may not have time to get entirely through the second section, so I'm really going to focus on the first. In the first section, I'm going to analyze some instances of direct, enthusiastic transatlantic dialogue between Portuguese and Brazilian men of letters during the turn of the 20th century. I'm going to focus specifically in this section on three key moments. First, the Brazilian writer and diplomat Joaquim Nabuco, and speeches he gave in 1880 and 1888 at Rio de Janeiro's Gabinete Português de Leitura, or Portuguese reading room. The second moment is the publication of the historian Oliveira Martins' volume O Brasil e as Colônias Portuguesas in 1888, also titled in English, Brazil and the Portuguese Colonies. And the final third moment is a 1916 visit made to Portugal by the Brazilian poet Olavo Bilac, who was received in Lisbon by the Portuguese poet Guerra Junqueiro. In the second section, time permitting, I'll describe a case of less overt or conscious dialogue across the Atlantic. I'll focus specifically on a conceptual motif that has deep roots in Portuguese language and culture. This is the term sobranceria, a term that in Portuguese denotes pride, a strong sense of individual independence or self-worth, or less charitably, haughty ignorance. I'll demonstrate how, during this period, the idea of sobranceria snaked its way across the Atlantic, moving from the work of the aforementioned Oliveira Martins to the work of two Brazilians who were to varying degrees unsympathetic to Martins. These are the historians Manuel Bonfim and the great Brazilian historian and critic Sérgio Buarque de Holanda. So, the first part of my talk. As I've already alluded to, transatlantic, Lusophone literary culture remained vibrant during the final decades of the 19th century, and indeed up until the 1920s, a decade that witnessed Brazilian modernism's attempt to, in Casanova's words, put an end to Brazil's linguistic dependence upon Portugal. However, as the Portuguese critic Eduardo Lourenço has remarked, quote, despite Brazil's desire to reinforce its own cultural identity, despite the nativist myths, intellectual life in 19th century Brazil was still very Portuguese, end quote. Portuguese novelists, especially the great realist, the comic realist Essa de Queiroz, were widely read in Brazil. Brazilian newspapers regularly published articles by Portuguese writers, including Essa and Oliveira Martins. While Brazilian literature did not enjoy the same influence or prestige in Portugal, certain Brazilian authors, including the great novelist and short story writer Machado de Assis, were read in Portugal, and Machado and other Brazilian writers contributed columns to Portuguese newspapers. Finally, during this period, several transatlantic Portuguese publications were founded, which covered Brazilian affairs, featured Brazilian writers, and solicited Brazilian subscribers. And this is an area that I'd really like to explore further once I'm able to clear the backlog of pending projects. Examples of these publications include the Revista Moderna, which was published between 1897 and 99. Incidentally, Essa de Queiroz edited that journal, as well as Brasil Portugal, the longest lived of these publications. That ran for 15 years between 1899 and 1914. In the inaugural February 1st, 1899 issue of Brasil Portugal, the editors, one of whom incidentally was João do Rio, described Brazil and Portugal as, quote, two nations bonded by blood, by feeling, and by tradition, end quote. As we'll see, this familial rhetoric was common. For their part, Brazilian publications such as O Jornal do Comércio, which survives until today, to which Nabuco contributed, as well as O País and A Cigarra, had Portuguese writers on staff and took a generally sympathetic view of Portugal. Portuguese-speaking writers during this period frequently described Luso-Brazilian ties using a familial language in which, metaphorically, Portugal gave birth to Brazil, or, perhaps in deference to the polycentric character of the Luso-Brazilian world, with its outsized former American colony and relatively weak metropolis, apologies to Portugal, Portugal and Brazil were presented as siblings. The rationale for this language of family is fairly straightforward. In describing the former Luso-Brazilian Empire, indeed in familial terms, these writers, I argue, sought to reinforce a feeling of collective belonging, a sense of shared Luso-Brazilian we or us that would exist in counter-distinction to geopolitical and cultural or linguistic others, such as the Hispanic and Anglo-American worlds. And just as an aside, this was an interesting discovery for me because in my first book project, Nosa y Nuestra America, a key part of my argument was that this fraternal familial rhetoric was commonly employed in Spanish-speaking Latin America by prominent essayists as a way to reinforce the notion that the former Spanish colonies were united and that their unity could be seen in terms of an extended Latin American family. You find this, for instance, in writers like José Enrique Rodó, who we're going to discuss today in our mini course, as well as the Cuban independence leader José Martí and his famous notion of Nuestra America, or our America. On the Brazilian side, when Brazilian public intellectuals have addressed ties to Spanish-speaking Latin America, I noticed in my first book that this same familial rhetoric was very much absent. What I wasn't cognizant of at that time was that this same familiar rhetoric was being deployed by Brazilian writers, but they were employing it in terms of shared, makes sense, in terms of shared historical, cultural, and linguistic ties with countries like Portugal, and later with the countries of Portuguese-speaking Africa. Okay, so end of aside. In Joaquim Nabuco's case, his Lusophilia seems to have been rooted in family circumstances and politics. The aristocratic Portuguese origin Nabuco family had played a prominent role in Brazilian public life since the colonial period. And Joaquim, as a committed defender of the Brazilian monarchy, once that monarchy had fallen, called for Brazil to retain its distinctive, implicitly Lusophone identity and to resist cultural approximation to Spanish-speaking Latin America. A negative possibility he termed, rather creatively, Sul-Americanização, or South Americanization. These factors help explain his characterization of Luso-Brazilian relations during the first of his two speeches given at the Gabinete Português de Leitura, which, by the way, is a fantastic library, but also was funded by the Portuguese immigrant community in Rio de Janeiro. So this is very much a Portuguese space. He gave this first speech on the inaugural Dia de Portugal, celebrated on June 10th, which commemorates the anniversary of the Renaissance poet Luís de Camões' death. Nabuco asked, quote, "If today is Portugal's day, is it not better for Portugal if we consider its national holiday a family affair?" End quote. In his 1888 speech, also given at the Gabinete Português, Nabuco affirmed Brazil and Portugal's overarching commonality of cultural nationality and language, declaring, quote, "I will only concede that Brazil is for you a foreign country in one sense, in the sense that we are, politically speaking, a separate nationality," end quote. Moving on to the Portuguese historian Oliveira Martins, he describes Portugal, Brazil, and Lusophone Africa as components of a common historical system in his historical study, O Brasil e as Colônias Portuguesas. Here he terms Brazil the, quote, "legitimate child of Portuguese society," end quote. The Portuguese historian, who was fond of biological metaphors, explained Luso-Brazilian relations as follows, and this is a typically creative description by Oliveira Martins. Just as birds, sheltered in the nest by their mother, fly to freedom as soon as their wings will carry them, so do a nation's children long for their freedom as soon as a new individual identity begins to breathe within them. A child's independence never provokes a hostile reaction in his parent, except when a parent tries to prolong a state of dependence that has become anachronistic, end quote. Martins notes that, quote, "though politically separate from us, our former colony is today the nation to which we are most intimately tied." He also argued for the political and economic advantages to Portugal of Brazil's independence. For Martins, Brazilian independence was a historical inevitability that nonetheless did not annul Portugal and Brazil's appreciable and broadly beneficial family ties. Finally, the poet Olavo Bilac made a trip in 1916 to Lisbon, and this trip provides the third occasion for our examination of Luso-Brazilian transatlantic ties around the turn of the 20th century. On March 30th of that year, Bilac, who incidentally was a noted proponent of Brazilian patriotism during the early Republican years, addressed the Academia das Ciências de Lisboa and cited the example of José Bonifácio, a Brazilian-born, Portuguese-educated hero of Brazil's independence. And he cited Bonifácio, interestingly enough, in justifying his own dual loyalties to Brazil, which had recently thrown off the empire. And it's notable that the Brazilian Empire, which existed from 1822 until 1889, had a member of the Portuguese royal family, the Braganças, on the throne. So by ending the empire, this is as I said earlier, this is the final nail in the coffin of the now defunct Luso-Brazilian Empire. The final tie between Portugal and Brazil has been severed, and this was commented upon during the period. But in any case, Bilac looks to Bonifácio in order to justify his dual and for him, not mutually exclusive loyalties to Brazil and to the Portuguese past. And his familial rhetoric here, I think, recalls both Nabucco and Martins. So this is what he says, quote, "The founder of a new country, our man, that is, Bonifácio, did not reject the mother country which had nurtured his spirit. There was in this separation nothing of the ungrateful creature who confronts and rejects his creator on the first day of his new existence. Rather, his was a right and a duty, a case of necessary self-preservation and preservation of the race. He was an adult son who self-consciously fulfills his mission, who, emancipated from his father, builds a new home in which the name, religion, and honor of the old home are preserved." In a March 31st address, which he entitled Aos Homens de Letras de Portugal, to the Men of Letters of Portugal, which Bilac gave at a banquet offered by the publication Atlântida, which is an interesting case of one of these transoceanic collaborative publications between Brazil and Portugal. Bilac spoke of, quote, "Portugal and Brazil, two countries that will always be sisters," end quote. And he also referred to a shared Luso-Brazilian race, civilization, and language. The Portuguese poet, Guerra Junqueiro, responded to Bilac in his speech, which he entitled Brasil-Portugal, which was given on occasion of an address that Bilac gave shortly thereafter in Lisbon on April 3rd, 1916, in the Teatro da República. Junqueiro described the significance of Brazil's independence as follows, quote, "Our countries divorced one another so that they might better embrace in marriage. Their bodies..." I don't understand how that works, but you'll see. "Their bodies separated in order that their souls might come together. Becoming two, they came to love each other more. Their love became more beautiful because it became freer. Living free and apart from each other, today we are closer than ever, in glory and in our dreams, in our sighs and kisses, in laughter and pain." It sounds better in Portuguese. "Loving each other across the waves, we conquer the space that separates us." So this is where I got the title, Across the Waves, Através das Ondas. It's another image that I think reinforces the notion that these writers who were running counter to the prevailing political tide were trying to imagine of Luso-Brazilian literary and cultural ties, even after Brazil declares itself a republic, which led to instances of anti-Portuguese discrimination and violence in Rio de Janeiro and elsewhere in Brazil. How much time do I have left approximately? Okay, so I'll get into the second part of my talk. If I have to abridge it a little bit, that's fine. I'd like to leave enough time for some questions. So in the second part of my talk, I'm going to pivot a little bit. I've just gotten done talking about some instances of Portuguese and Brazilian writers who collaborated with one another at the turn of the 20th century. Now I'm going to talk about a case of involuntary and implicit influence that was felt by Brazilian writers, and this was influence that came from a Portuguese writer who, in their own work, they declared that they were either suspicious of to a certain degree or even openly hostile to. So this is an interesting combination of influence as well as a kind of antipathy toward Portugal. So the Brazilian writer and critic Silviano Santiago wrote a book in 2006 called As Raízes e o Labirinto da América Latina, The Roots in the Labyrinth of Latin America. It's a comparative study of the Brazilian historian and essayist Sérgio Buarque de Holanda and the Mexican essayist Octavio Paz. In his analysis of Buarque's classic study of Brazilian history, Raízes do Brasil, published in 1936, Santiago points to the, quote, Spanish term sobrancería, written in the original, as a key concept. The passage of Buarque that Santiago cites, in which Buarque describes individualism as a core component of what he thought of as an overarching peninsular character, reads as follows, quote, "This idea is faithfully mirrored in a truly Hispanic word, sobrancería, a word that initially suggests the idea of overcoming. Santiago, commenting on this passage, observes, quote, by using the term sobrancería, Sergio retains its original meaning, but deterritorializes it. In recontextualizing it as a descriptive tool adapted to the reality of colonial Brazil, he leaves it to us to find an equivalent term in Portuguese." Santiago's argument depends then on the importation of an apparently Spanish origin term, sobrancería, to Buarque's own Portuguese language text. According to Santiago, the identifiably Spanish provenance of sobrancería, which is spelled as per Santiago, S-O-B-R-A-N-C-E-R-I with an accent A, amounts to a conscious allusion on Buarque's part to an elusive equivalent term in Portuguese. The difficulty of Santiago's interpretation is twofold. First, the word sobrancería is exceedingly uncommon in contemporary Spanish, and believe me, I've looked a lot. Whereas its Portuguese equivalent, spelled the same way but without the accent on the I, is not exactly common, but appears fairly regularly in literary and academic discourse. And again, I found numerous examples because I didn't want to make this claim without a lot of evidence to back it up. And second, and more fundamentally, the term Buarque uses in Raízes do Brasil is the Portuguese term sobrancería without the accent mark, contrary to Santiago's assumption. As such, it appears much more likely to me that the sobrancería, and again, sobrancería in Portuguese and to a certain degree in Spanish, refers to excessive pride, individualism, manliness, but also in a negative sense, arrogance, perhaps petulance, disdain. So you can think of this as the two sides of the stereotypical Iberian or Spanish hero, the valiant knight who is brave and bold, but who is also arrogant and who is perhaps not a team player. So this is a great word if you want to talk about the Iberian roots of Latin American culture. But Santiago thinks that this is coming from Spain, whereas my argument is that, yes, this is a term that's been used to talk about the Iberian character of Latin American culture, but it's actually, this is a discourse that's been going on for decades, if not centuries, primarily in Portugal and then in Brazil, not so much in Spain. Similar discussions are happening in Spain, but not using the term sobrancería. So when Buarque uses sobrancería, he's working within a tradition that comes from Portugal and that moves to Brazil, crossing the Atlantic, of speculation on the Iberian character, first of all, of Portugal, and then of Brazil. It's important to note that, again, I'm identifying sobrancería as a specifically Portuguese origin term here, but this does not forfeit its right to be considered a truly Hispanic word, as Buarque tells us, since Portuguese is, in point of fact, just as Hispanic a language as Spanish. And it's interesting because in the recently published English translation of Raízes do Brasil, published by Notre Dame, the translator translates uma palavra bem hispânica as a very Spanish word, whereas I think that it's more exact to say it's a very Hispanic word. And by saying Hispanic as opposed to Spanish, you allow for the possibility that Portugal is itself Hispanic, which I think makes much more sense in the context of this argument. Indeed, the admittedly stereotyped characterization of the sobranceiro Iberian finds expression in heroic figures like El Cid, who for the Portuguese historian Oliveira Martins was, and I quote him, the Spanish warrior, end quote, and is satirized by Cervantes in his famous Quixote, and by the Portuguese playwright Gil Vicente in texts like The Alto da Índia, which features a stereotypical Castelhano, simply named O Castelhano, who's a blowhard, and a parody of peninsular hombridad. So in this second section of my talk, I'm going to comment on some references to sobrancería in the work of three celebrated Luso-Brazilian intellectuals, all of whom were preoccupied with the question of Brazil's Iberian and more specifically Portuguese roots. So I'm just going to cite a few examples. I don't want to, this is going to get pretty boring pretty quickly if I share all of my fun examples with you. And I put fun in scare quotes. So first of all, Oliveira Martins. The term sobranceria and the adjective sobranceiro appear regularly in Martins's writing, and point to what he considered aspects of a distinctly Iberian and by extension Luso-Brazilian collective personality. And we've been delving into this issue in the mini course. These features that, according to Oliveira Martins, characterize the Iberian character include, quote, heroic individualism, manliness, an adventurer's spirit, personal austerity, and, quote, an indomitable and heroic feeling of independence. One of his first written references to sobranceria is found in an 1878 letter he wrote to his fellow Portuguese writer Ramalho Ortigão. Here, Martins offers a scathing critique of Lisbon's fashionable youth, who incidentally were a preferred target of their mutual friend, the novelist Essa de Queiroz. If you read novels such as O Primo Basílio, Cousin Basílio, or Os Maias, the Mayas, you'll see this. Martins writes, and I'm going to translate from the Portuguese, quote, more than one foreigner, after having spent some time among us, has observed the ridiculous sobranceria with which they, i.e. the elegant urban dandies of Lisbon, affect a superior connerie, which they consider Parisian. Never mind that they've never been to Paris, or if they have only seen the boulevard at midnight from the Café Américain. This ridiculous half-mocking sobranceria with which they laugh at things. Alexandre Herculano, who was a famous Portuguese historian, believed that for every 10 men in the Casa Havanesa, an important and historic cafe and bar in Lisbon, only 1 of 10 knew that the earth was round, end quote. If for Martins, sobranceria is a self-affirmative tendency, it can also devolve into absurd arrogance when it's not sustained by true superiority of character. But this doesn't make sobranceria any less distinctly Portuguese or Iberian. Indeed, for Martins, sobranceria was a trait that in periods of civilizational ascent might productively contribute to the affirmation of individual or collective personality, but that could also signal civilizational decline in less fortunate periods. So in another title by Oliveira Martins, his History of Portugal, Historia de Portugal, which he published in 1879, Martins profiles the Duke of Bragança, a Portuguese nobleman executed by the order of King João II. He comments that, quote, for this nobleman, who was nearly a king, it was sobranceria that allowed him to maintain his haughty dignity even on the executioner's stand. So essentially, what Oliveira Martins is getting at is that sobranceria, when sustained by true heroism, by true nobility, true superiority of character, is a good thing. When it's not sustained by those qualities, it's actually a mark of the decline of a civilization. But the constant element is that sobranceria is characteristic of Iberian culture as that culture ascends through the maritime expansion and the formation of global empire and with political influence, and then it declines with the marginalization of the Spanish and Portuguese states. Okay, so moving on to Manuel Bonfim. Manuel Bonfim is a Brazilian historian who in recent decades has reemerged as an important early interpreter of the Brazilian Republic. One thing I find fascinating about him is that he hates Oliveira Martins, at the same time as he quotes Oliveira Martins extensively. This also interests the Brazilian academic Paulo Franchetti, who in his very accurately titled essay, Oliveira Martins e o Brasil, Oliveira Martins and Brazil, observes the ironic fact that the Brazilian historian Bonfim, who was an assiduous promoter of Brazilian patriotism and a virulent critic of Portuguese colonialism, organized his, quote, anti-Portuguese discourse by drawing wholeheartedly and extensively on Oliveira Martins's works. So this is the basic dilemma. Why would somebody who had so much antipathy for Oliveira Martins make such use of his ideas, even as he criticizes them vociferously? Now, Bonfim's Lusophobia, or anti-Portuguese feeling, was not atypical during this period, but Bonfim's particular hostility toward Martins is notable. In Bonfim's 1905 study, América Latina, Males de Origem, or Latin America, Originary Ills, which, with its comparative framework, for me recalls Martins' own History of Iberian Civilization, also published in 1879, Bonfim denounces the scientific racism evident in Martins's volume on Brazil, which I was talking about a bit earlier, and he tars the Portuguese historian as, quote, the principal promoter of Portuguese of the calumny, the gross and immoral distortion of social Darwinism. Granted, this charge does seem legitimate, but Bonfim's other critiques of Martins speak to a particular antipathy that, in my view, transcends mere intellectual objections. And reading between the lines seems quite personal, though beyond this intuition of mine, I really have no evidence or explanation for Bonfim's apparent dislike of Martins, and to my knowledge, the two never met, which is probably good. In Bonfim's O Brasil na América, which he published in 1829, Bonfim offers a frankly eccentric interpretation of Martins, who, as we've talked about in the mini-course, was a severe critique of the Portuguese state and one of the principal theoreticians in Portugal of the idea of peninsular decline or decadence. In other words, he was far from an uncritical nationalist. But according to Bonfim, the Martins' apparently exaggerated patriotism led him to distort his vision of history. This characterization ignores the strong dose of national self-criticism in Martins and evinces a certain hypocrisy, given that the aggressive national pride that he's charging Oliveira Martins with perpetuating is actually found in spades in Bonfim's own work, particularly beginning with the publication of his study O Brasil na América, or Brazil in America. Nevertheless, for Bonfim, it's Martins' patriotic obsession that leads him to excesses. Bonfim comments ironically on Martins' love of country and describes him as a, quote, poet without vision. It's kind of a low blow. The criticism continues in Bonfim's O Brasil na História, Brazil in History, in which Martins is ridiculed for his obsessive patriotism, his predisposition against Brazil, and his questionable historical judgment. So given this hostility, which I repeat, I really don't think is merely intellectual, it's curious to observe how Bonfim reproduces Martins' ideas on sobranceria, but merely transposing them onto the Brazilian and Latin American context. So I'm just going to find one or two quotes so we can get to Buarque as well. In his early work on Latin America, Bonfim describes quote, an intransigent, irreducible patriotic manliness that inspires individuals toward acts of heroism and resistance. This sounds a lot like Martins. Let's see. What's another good one here? Oh yeah, this is fun. So after charging that Oliveira Martins is a xenophobic ultranationalist in Portugal, Bonfim then talks about the brutality of Portugal's maritime expansion. So, for instance, he says the following, quote, giving themselves over to theft and piracy, the adventurous spirit of the Portuguese took flight. Despite viewing Martins as incapable of this kind of judgment, in fact, in his History of Portugal, Martins commented, and I'm repeating from yesterday, quote, our empire in the Orient was a disaster for the Orient and for us. And indeed, Martins observes in a statement that Bonfim himself quoted that, quote, on the high seas there was anarchic theft, on land a series of bloody depredations. Doesn't exactly seem to be pro-empire in this moment. Okay, so I'm going to finish up with Sergio Buarque de Holanda very quickly. The basic take-home message here for Buarque, who's probably the most famous of these three writers, is that, first of all, he hardly at all refers to Bonfim. Indeed, he doesn't refer to him at all in Raízes do Brasil and only refers to him once, by my count, in other works. And he only refers to Oliveira Martins once, and very critically, in a passage that has nothing actually to do with sobranceria. Nonetheless, there are several observations that Buarque makes in Raízes do Brasil that point to the influence of the Portuguese historian. So just to give you a couple of examples. Let's see here. So Buarque mentions Sobranceria in the discussion, or in the context of his introductory discussion on differences in character between the Iberians and Europeans from Além Pyreneus, or beyond the Pyrenees. He writes, quote, "None of the neighboring peoples were able to develop to the same extent this culture of personality, which from time immemorial has been the most important element in the development of the Hispanic people. It can truly be stated that the Spanish and Portuguese owe their originality as nations to the particular importance they attribute to the value of the person, to man's temporal and spatial autonomy in relation to other men. In Buarque's analysis, Iberian sobranceria, which European colonization brought to the Americas, persists, whether for good or ill, as a decisive factor in the definition of the Brazilian and Spanish-American character." So, let's see. I'm going to find a couple substantiating quotes from Oliveira Martins here. So it's interesting to note that both Oliveira Martins and Buarque use the phrase gênio aventureiro, or adventurer's genius, or adventurer's spirit, in characterizing Brazilians, and specifically in characterizing the Bandeirantes. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Brazilian history, the term bandeirante refers to a kind of explorer, and in some cases slave catcher, in some cases treasure hunter, who during the colonization of Brazil moved from Sao Paulo through the interior of the country. And in fact, if you look at the geographic outlines of Brazil, and you know something about the Treaty of Tordesillas, which in 1494 split the world into Spanish and Portuguese spheres of influence, you'll see that Brazil's much larger than it should be, according to that treaty. And it's often the case that bandeirantes are given credit for enlarging Brazil's territory through their explorations of the interior of Brazil. And in both the case of Oliveira Martins and Sergio Buarque, what motivates these explorations is precisely this spirit of adventure. So I'd like to read a couple quotes where they talk about this. So, for instance, in O Brasil e as Colônias Portuguesas, Martins says the following, quote, "The Paulista's adventurous spirit was the first soul of the Brazilian nation." He also talks about the adventurous spirit of the peninsular peoples in his history of Iberian civilization. And then we come to Buarque, and Buarque says the following regarding the Bandeirantes. He says, quote, "These audacious Indian hunters, trackers and takers of riches, were above all pure adventurers." So I'm not going to have time to give you all of the examples of Oliveira Martins' apparent influence in Buarque, but I would like to conclude by returning to the text that I quoted in the opening of this talk, the study The World Republic of Letters. And in that book, the critic Pascal Casanova describes literary republics as territories that are marked by, quote, "literary frontiers that are independent of political boundaries, dividing up a world that is secret and yet perceptible to all." The Luso-Brazilian writers I've profiled, Oliveira Martins, Joaquim Nabuco, Olavo Bilac, and Guerra Junqueiro, engaged in what, along with Casanova, we might term the literary demarcation of frontiers in their attempt to affirm a transatlantic Luso-Brazilian republic of letters in the wake of the Luso-Brazilian Empire's political disintegration. Adopting a familial rhetoric, these Fond de Siècle men of letters, actively sought, as the poet Junqueiro put it, to, quote, "conquer the space that separates us." In recovering their transatlantic gestures, we may better appreciate how at the turn of the 20th century, and despite the centrifugal and disintegrative political tendencies of the time, certain Luso-Brazilian writers tenaciously worked to preserve transatlantic literary and cultural relationships across the waves. Thank you.
Hi, this is a question. It's probably more of a comment Have you by chance seen Casanova's recent article? It's a New Literary History, just last year, 2013. Because in there she talks about something she overlooked in her book, and that thing is the fact of translation. And dominant versus less dominant languages. And I was thinking at this interesting sort of bit you were doing with sort of the status of the Hispanic, somewhat ambiguous. I'm wondering if you had seen that Casanova piece, and you could sort of comment, if you had, on how that translational project would work in that kind of a domain. And if you had, and it's just a suggestion, you might want to take a look at it, because I think it's really interesting, and it goes to your project, I think, very nicely.
Yeah, I haven't looked at it, but the notion of translation, I think that she might have gotten part of the way toward describing that problem in the World Republic of Letters when she talks about the comparative influence or worth of literary languages. And she uses the image of like a stock market or or an exchange. And I think that one of the interesting factors that I didn't really deal with in this paper, but that perhaps helped motivate Brazilian and Portuguese writers to go toward the trouble of affirming their continued interest in one another, was precisely the fact of the linguistic marginalization and particularity of Portuguese. That was certainly the case for Nabucco, who, after the fall of the Brazilian Empire, was very afraid that Brazil would become South American, in the sense that the Spanish-speaking republics were South American. And for him, an important, indeed, in Brazil's sort of national mythos, one of the key components of Brazilian particularity in the world is the fact that it doesn't speak Spanish, but rather speaks Portuguese. And so I think the particularity and specificity of the Portuguese language, the fact that on the European side, the primary influence that's conditioning Brazilian nationhood comes from Portugal, albeit in a broader sense it also comes from Iberia. That's important for these writers. And once you get to Brazilian modernism in the 1920s, the question of language and how Portuguese should be written, either according to Lusitanian norms or in line with spoken Brazilian Portuguese, becomes quite polemical. But I'll certainly check out that article, and thank you for the reference.
Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting. I am wondering about some funny Spanish novels. There's a novel, Genio y Figura, by Juan Valera, which is published in 1897, but set in Brazil.
Right.
And then I'm thinking of Paradox Rey by Baroja, which is all about colonialism in Africa. It talks about the French, but there's no mention of Portuguese Africa. And I'm just wondering, what do you make of Spain's thoughts about the possibility of a Republic of Letters between the Americas and Iberia at that time?
In the case of Juan Valera, who wrote Genio y Figura, Valera was notable in that era as a Spanish writer for the degree of his experience of the Portuguese-speaking world and his contacts with Portuguese and Brazilian writers. So Oliveira Martins, who I quoted from, dedicated his History of Iberian Civilization, beginning in the second edition, to Valera. And after doing so, Oliveira Martins begins a correspondence with Valera, where he talks about Valera's literary talent and tries to exchange some ideas on commonalities and differences between the Portuguese and the Spanish. This leads Valera to write a series of articles that are a review of the history of Iberian civilization, and the title is simply Historia de la Civilización Ibérica. So there's a good deal of exchange going on there between Valera and Martins. And then Genio y Figura, also Mor's Amor, is a really badly written historical novel by Valera, but he credits Oliveira Martins' Historia de Portugal with giving him a lot of the material that he worked with for this novel, which takes place, as I recall, in the Indian Ocean and has to do with Portuguese colonialism in India. So in his case, there's definitely a lot of overlap and dialogue. In the case of I don't know much about Baroja biographically. I don't know the extent to which he was engaged with Portuguese issues or Portuguese writers. But there are certainly examples on the Spanish side of writers, Unamuno included, who had a lot to say about Portugal and Portugal's relations with the relations of the Portuguese-speaking world with the Spanish-speaking world. But it's really selective. It's hard to come to a consensus view as to what the Spanish Republic of Letters thought of Portugal during this period.
Rob, thanks for the talk. I have I'm curious to know how you read anthropophagy, which comes, right on the heel of this in Brazil, which is a transatlantic I get orientation on the part of Brazil towards Europe and other cultures. Is that how do you read that in terms of Nabucco, Manuel Bonfim, even Serge Buarque de Holanda, which is at the same happening at the same period?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as histories of Brazilian literature will often talk about the period from 1900 to about 1920 as if nothing occurred during that period. They'll move from the great Machado de Assis to the moment you alluded to, the Cannibalist Manifesto by Oswald de Andrade, and the explosion of modernism in Sao Paulo and other cities in Rio, or other cities in Brazil like Rio. I think that in one sense, the idea of cultural cannibalism of Brazil by Brazil of foreign cultural and literary influences certainly represents a shift. And I think in terms of the ideas and the ideology that you see guiding the project of the Luso-Brazilian Republic of Letters, it's certainly a break with that notion. The way that the Portuguese tradition is described and ridiculed in texts, for instance, like Macunaíma by Mário de Andrade, the Cannibalist Manifesto by Oswald de Andrade. There's a kind of a somewhat playful but somewhat hostile characterization of Portugal as, at the end of the day, not particularly important to Brazil's national identity going forward. And indeed, it almost seems like in the Cannibalist Manifesto, if we exclude certain references to Portuguese colonization, the real dialogue is taking place between Brazil and France. So that's an interesting distinction. At the same time, Sergio Buarque, who after all was a modernista as a young man, was also notable for his degree of interest and his increasing interest. First of all, his initial interest in Spanish-speaking Latin America. He wrote a number of literary reviews about Latin American novels, but he didn't reject the notion of an overarching Luso-Brazilian character the way that some of the more radical modernistas seemed to do. And he, I think, was more in line with a writer like Gilberto Freire, who would articulate something of the same notion in the ideas that would later be characterized as Luso-tropicalismo. So at the end of the day, I suppose it represents partial continuity, but also a break. But I think the problem is not so much with the modernistas themselves. The problem is with literary scholars who continue to claim that this period was marked entirely by a rightful sort of hostility toward a decadent Portugal, when in reality, if you look at some of these very prominent writers, Olavo Bilac was a very important man of letters during this period and was very much associated with building support for the Republic. He's also traveling to Lisbon. He's engaging with Portuguese writers. João do Rio was co-editing a volume, or not a volume, a journal that was published jointly by Portugal and Brazil. So there's a lot of residual, perhaps, contact going on between writers on both sides of the Atlantic, which runs counter both to the political climate as well as how literary criticism looking back has characterized this period. So I think we need to recover some of these contacts.